Voters in Afghanistan crowded into polling stations on April 5th to cast their votes for a new president. Now, former Foreign Minister Abdullah is leading the vote count with final results due May 14th and a runoff to be held if no candidate wins an outright majority.
Well, the election was relatively peaceful despite Taliban threats to disrupt it with violence, but the run-up to the vote saw weeks of attacks, including on journalists.
If successful, the election will mark Afghanistan's first democratic transfer of power. But with foreign combat forces set to leave by the end of this year, what is next for the country? I posed that question to VOA correspondent Sharon Behn, who was in Afghanistan for the vote, and here is what she had to say.
Well, that's a pretty big question. And I think that's a question that everybody has in their mind. You know, what happens out? It really depends on how this election plays out. It really does. It really depends on how credible it is that the losing candidate accepts defeat. To see perhaps they're going to do some political accommodation. Whoever wins, whoever loses, they might give them some political accommodation within the government. And if they sign the bilateral security agreement with the United States, which a lot of people that I spoke to were hoping that they do sign it because that would prolong the American presence in Afghanistan in a sort of teaching and training mode and also as an emergency backup. I think there are a lot of questions this year, and people are already beginning to say, well, what happens when, the summertime comes? That's always a big Taliban fighting season. I think there are a lot of questions outstanding. I don't think anybody could answer that right now.
And Sharon, getting back to the security situation, the recent killing of AP Associated Press photographer Anya Niedringhaus, how have these attacks affected you, and what's behind these attacks on journalists?
Yeah, the attacks on journalists were actually very jarring. Mostly because, it's like any attack on any civilian. We're unarmed. We're not there to actually do anything except be neutral and try to report. The first attack was on a British-Swedish radio journalist. He was shot in the head in the middle of the street in daylight in Kabul. The second one was against a French a journalist, and actually an Afghan journalist who works for Agence France Presse, and his two children and his wife were shot in front of him before he was shot and killed. And then there was an attack on, as you said, Anya Niedringhaus, who unfortunately died, and Kathy Gannon, who was working with her, a very well-known AP journalist, and she was pretty badly wounded from what I understand. It actually did rattle the journalist community. A lot of us know these people. These are people that we know and work with, and it was a little hard to see that. And then to go out and say, okay, we have to do this anyway, we have to go report. I think all the journalists went out and all the journalists reported, local as well as international.
Political reconciliation with the militants is seen as the only way to end years of violence. For that to work, neighboring Pakistan, which has ties with the Taliban, has to be on board. Analyst Andrew Wilder with the United States Institute of Peace says the leading Afghan candidates acknowledge that.
The whole regional thing is going to be critical moving forward. I mean, I think it's long been recognized that this conflict is not just restricted to Afghanistan. It does have strong regional dynamic.
But the most immediate worries in Afghanistan are the candidates themselves, says Jandad Spingar, head of the Free and Fair Election Foundation of Afghanistan.
You can imagine if one of them, especially these strong candidates, one of them not accept the result, what will happen? Of course, their supporter will come on street and will protest.
That kind of upheaval, some believe, could lead to even more conflict in this already violence-ravaged country.
So what's the timeline on this? When will we know the outcome?
The vote itself, right now, doing is a partial count. So they're getting, I believe it's 5% from each province. There are 34 provinces. After that comes a preliminary result where they have more votes come in and they say, okay, after the partial, this is a preliminary result. But the final result won't really be known until mid-May. And that's actually quite important because in order for this election to be believed in by the people, it has to be proven that there wasn't mass fraud or mass vote rigging as there was in 2009.
And again, that was VOA correspondent Sharon Behn. An estimated 7 million people voted in this election in Afghanistan, and a big portion of them were young people. Interesting to note, Phil, that Afghanistan is actually one of the youngest countries in the world, with 68% of Afghans under the age of 25. So it'll be interesting to see how they map out the country's future.
Yeah, the young coming up to take over, yeah.
They are.